Hello, this is Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. I have a new episode today for the Covenant Creation curriculum series. Adam, the first son, and Genesis, the first Bible, is part 3 of this series. I'm keeping the 2024 date for sake of continuity and because the material dates back to there. Today we will look at an issue that I have pondered for many years, but has now become a major discussion and debate for those who embrace fulfillment. This is part 3, section 3, the end of the Adamic Age. I've made some comments about this topic in recent videos and book reviews on this channel. It's also a subject I have covered with a few introductory videos to covenant creation on this channel going back over a year ago. But I wanted to have one full episode in the curriculum series devoted to this issue because it is important. That way the material is arranged all together in one convenient location. This is a hot topic of conversation right now, which is really long overdue. I believe it will accelerate in the future for reasons I will explain in this video. Preterists have been so focused on eschatology, last things, and fulfillment of the end of the age by AD 70 that questions about protology, first things, and the beginning of the age have been neglected in past years. The issue of protology regarding this age in the New Testament has now come into view as a significant issue to work out. I have believed this to be inevitable for a long time, but very few have thought deeply about it until now. I plan to discuss some wider theological ramifications in part 4 to come related to Adam's world as the Old Covenant world in view of Bible eschatology. Here is the issue that creates much confusion and debate right now. Hear me out. What Christians call salvation theology will need to be understood from the context of the new covenant creation world, introduced by the Gospels and fully described in Revelation 21:22, if preterism is true. Now, why do I say that? Well, all versions of salvation theology in the history of church doctrine were formulated from the framework and paradigm of Futurism. The various Christian doctrines of salvation that have spawned countless debates over the centuries have all understood the end of the age as the end of the world to come in our future, along with a future parousia, judgment, and resurrection, which completes salvation. That's right. The parousia, resurrection, and final judgment of New Testament eschatology have always been viewed as the completing elements of Adamic salvation in traditional Christian salvation theology. Now, it's not hard to understand why. Church doctrine has developed from the context of Futurism for millennia. The issue is magnified since the Reformation times in our modern context. Why do I say that? Well, because Reformational theology focused on developing salvation theology out more thoroughly than it had ever been done in previous centuries, especially as related to what we call forensic justification and various understandings of the order of salvation, known by the Latin term Ordo Salutis. What is the final step in all versions of Ordo Salutis doctrine? Glorification. When does glorification take place? Glorification takes place at the second coming of Christ, the judgment at the end of the age, and the resurrection. This is the salvation theology that has been taught for many centuries. Well, the Reformational movement, with its many sects and subset doctrinal streams, did all their doctrinal work in a futurist context, which everyone accepted and believed as unquestioned orthodoxy. So this isn't a sectarian problem. Even Roman Catholic theology had already developed its own salvation theology in that same futurist framework and paradigm. The Reformation never challenged Rome's futurism. They simply assumed futurist eschatology and offered an alternative salvation theology related to Adamic salvation that dispensed with believers' merit as the ground of salvation. The Reformational theology rooted the covenant of grace with Adam, which goes back ultimately to Augustine's theology. So what is our situation now? Preterism comes along and makes the very bold claim that all these things, the end of the age, the parousia, the judgment, and the resurrection, were fulfilled in a covenant context by AD 70. Well, if that is true, then all the traditional forms of salvation theology have been made obsolete by preterism, whether people understand that fact or not. Some have seen this issue and have responded in a theological panic, even if they were convinced of fulfillment at one time. Their traditional salvation theology, which they learned as futurists, the historical doctrines of federal theology, developed from the context of futurism over centuries, is emotionally and culturally important to preterists. So what ends up happening? Well, there comes a point in time where the preterist has to come to grips with a dilemma. Will it be the traditional salvation theology rooted in Adam that will be the fundamental guiding doctrine? Or will the preterist view of the end of the age fulfilled, second coming fulfilled, judgment fulfilled, and resurrection fulfilled that will be the guiding doctrine? Which one proves ultimate? Traditional salvation theology or the past fulfillment of all New Testament prophecy? It's a dilemma that needs to be discussed more. Now, one response I have seen happen many times over the years is that when people who recently adopted preterist conclusions either gradually or suddenly pull back away from their preterist conclusions when they realize the implications. Typically, the response is to declare preterism defective and then go forward with an attempt to reformulate, rewrite, and rebrand preterism with an element of futurism in order to accommodate their own favored, ongoing salvation theology. I could name many names of those who have attempted this over the years. Some of them have concluded by abandoning preterism entirely in the end after further reflection and study. The full gravity of the inconsistency and incoherence of fulfilled eschatology and futurist salvation theology gradually dawns over time. The choice becomes this: emotional commitment to traditionalism on salvation theology side of the dilemma, or embrace preterism fully. And unfortunately, the salvation theology side of the dilemma often wins out because of emotional attachment. Well, another response is pure denial. Preterists can deny there is any connection to the end of the age and Adamic eschatology as understood historically for centuries and their Adamic salvation theology. This option just simply carries on with the teaching of both things simultaneously. They will say Jesus fulfilled all things in the Old Testament. New Testament eschatology is fulfilled, including the end of the age, parousia, judgment, and resurrection. But they also continue to teach Adamic salvation theology, carries on just as it did back when they were futurists. The contradiction is, how does salvation, as developed in traditional futurism, continue after the Adamic age came to an end? How does the Adamic salvation theology continue beyond the second coming and judgment of the Old Covenant world? No historical theology has ever suggested this conclusion. It would be a brand new concept to somehow continue the Adamic age beyond the consummation of the Adamic age to highlight the problem. Well, my thought is that there is a biblical third option. Is it possible that the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, all the way to Revelation 21 and 22, present a new covenant soteriology related to the new creation and the new Adam? Why not look to the new heavens and new earth, the new covenant creation, to develop a new covenant soteriology that matches preterist eschatology? I believe the solution to the dilemma can be found in a fresh look at Scripture rather than a retreat from preterism back into the comfortable salvation theologies that preterists took for granted before embracing fulfillment. In other words, the way to solve the problem is to work through it from a preterist perspective, rather than to retreat from preterism and abandon the conclusion of fulfillment. So realize that if there is a new heavens and earth, which there is, then covenant relationship to God must be understood in that context. This would still be a Christ-based soteriology, even if the Adamic order is the original Old Covenant world, which entirely passed away in the first century. So two covenant creations offer us an opportunity to think this through carefully. And what I am asking is if it is worth it to objectively consider how preterism can lead to theological development and new conclusions about salvation theology. What if this sort of progress could even potentially solve, or maybe even transcend, some historic debates in church history about salvation theology that appear impossible to resolve within a futurist context? Maybe there is a reward somewhere in this theological progress if we think carefully about the full implications of preterism for the long term. So my goal is to introduce and explore that in depth in part 4, but I need to lay some groundwork here to prepare for that material. Let's develop this with some specific questions, which are really all variations on the same question. When Old Covenant Israel was judged in AD 70, did it mark the end of the Adamic Age going back to Genesis 1 through 3? Or is the Protology of the end of the age sourced somewhere else in our Bible? This is quite a significant question. Number 2, what age came to a complete and final end when Matthew 24 was fulfilled? Jesus' teaching in the Olivet Discourse is a response to the disciples' private questions in Matthew 24:3. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? I will note here that if the end of the age was not fulfilled by AD 70, then Matthew 24 cannot be fulfilled in the first century, at least not fully. It would be at most a typological or a definitive fulfillment with another fuller or double fulfillment to come at the end of the world. Futurism's answer to the second question is none. They say this age did not end in AD 70 because we still live in this age. Futurism views the end of the age in terms of the future, not the past. This is root of one popular option about Matthew 24 proposed by Futurism called double fulfillment. Number 3, well, I think these questions can be asked from a different angle using biblical typology. What did Jesus fulfill in his ministry, death, burial, resurrection, and parousia? Was it only a particular part of the Old Testament, or did Jesus fulfill everything in the Old Testament, going all the way back to Adam? I think the answer to that question is obvious, but if it is yes, then it has implications for the telos and goal of the Adamic Age to be located in the first century. If the end of the age was not fulfilled by Jesus in the first century in any final way, then the parousia, judgment, and resurrection cannot be fulfilled in any final way in the first century. Those are all related and interconnected redemptive events in New Testament eschatology. Therefore, the nature and timing of their fulfillment must be understood in a consistent manner. A partial or definitive only fulfillment of the end of the age necessarily requires a partial and definitive only fulfillment of the parousia, judgment, and resurrection. Most futurists understand this. So number 4, the opening episode of this part 3 presented Adam as the first priest in the Bible. Let's build on that. Is Adam's dominion as the first priest typologically related to Jesus' dominion as the final high priest? Well, if so, Jesus would fulfill that type with surprising implications. If Adam is presented as the first priest, then it brings a covenant and temple context to the ancient meaning of Genesis 1 through 3. And that would set a covenant context for the first garden scene, just as preterists understand the new heavens and new earth in new covenant context. Well, Adam plays a large role in Paul's theology of resurrection in the New Testament. That fact provides prima facie evidence that the end of the Adamic Age is indeed the subject of New Testament eschatology, related to resurrection life through Christ from the death of Adam? So my answer to all these questions is simply yes. I believe the Adamic Protology for the end of the age can be confirmed by examining a variety of scholarship, including premillennialist, amillennialist, and even postmillennialist writers. They all agree that the end of the age is inseparably tied to the beginning of the age with the story of Adam. What's more, they all agree the coming of Christ, judgment, and resurrection represents the consummation and conclusion of the Adamic Age. So I'm not limiting this to preterist theology. This is the framework Augustine introduced more than 1,500 years ago. Of course, Augustine was a futurist. So I'm confident that the scholarship, all of it, even futurist scholarship, will back me up as to the unity of these eschatological items: end of the age, parousia, judgment, and resurrection. We will tour some of that evidence. My next video will take a different approach to examine the creation and garden scene directly from Genesis 1 through 3 to see if the context of Adam in the garden is textually linked to Israel's Old Covenant. Some examples would be life and death, promised land and exile, garden and temple, in the unfolding story of Adam and Israel. So the next video will provide a second witness, an independent line of evidence showing the Old Covenant structure and detail of Genesis creation, which is explicit in Genesis 1 through 3. So let's continue with a basic preterist understanding of the biblical meaning of the end of the age. Douglas Wilson explains it this way in his 1993 chapter titled Biblical Pictures of the New Cosmos in the little book, And It Came to Pass. This is about 32 years ago. The Bible describes human history as divided up into ages. As we read the New Testament, we discover that the writers of the sacred volume considered themselves to have been living at a terminal point for these ages. This did not mean that history was to end in their generation. They also quite clearly anticipated an age to come. The fact that they were at the end of the ages did not mean they were at the end of the world. Quite clearly, they anticipated an age to come. Paul's anticipation can be seen in his recognition of the supremacy of Christ, not only in his age, but also in the coming age. God has exalted Christ, he says, far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in that which is to come. So note at the top how Wilson has distinguished the end of the age from the end of the world in his eschatology. They are not equivalent. The end of the ages is not the end of the world. Now, if you think about that kingdom context, it's not hard to see a potential conclusion that I talk about a lot here on Covenant Creation on YouTube. If the end of the age doesn't have anything to do with the end of the world, then doesn't it seem at least plausible that the beginning of the age doesn't have anything to do with the beginning of the world, at least as defined as the material creation in the physical universe? The preterist view of the end of the age at least provokes a new question about the beginning of the heavens and earth in Genesis 1, related to the same covenant context we have already embraced as preterists regarding the end of the age. Wilson continues our 1993 introduction by saying this: if the Bible spoke only of an age to come, it would be possible to think that such an age would arrive thousands of years after writing the Bible. But the biblical authors do not just say there is a coming age, they also maintain that they were living at the end of their age. This means that the coming age must be, from their perspective, arriving soon. This new age is the Christian aeon in which we live. In this age, the age which the biblical writers referred to as the age to come, the temple is a spiritual one and will never be torn down, much less rebuilt. I find it fascinating that Wilson immediately presents the arrival of this new age in a temple context. He is following the biblical example we see in the Olivet Discourse, which associates the destruction of the temple with the end of the age. So a new age is necessarily related to a new temple in Christ. Temple context implies covenant context. And many now understand Genesis 1 through 3 as a temple dedication text related to worship and the story of Adam as the first priest, as we saw previously in this series. R.C. Sproul published his Last Days According to Jesus in 1998, just a few years after, and it came to pass in 1993. Closely linked to the issues surrounding the time frame question of the Olivet Discourse is the question of the biblical meaning of the end of the age. Does this phrase point to the end of the world history, the final consummation of the kingdom of Christ, or does it refer to the end of a particular divine economy, namely one in which Old Testament Israel figures prominently? Now, here again, divine economy is not synonymous with material world. And note again how this preterist approach distinguishes the end of the age from the end of world history or the physical universe. This is the introduction of covenant context to biblical eschatology. And so now the question becomes, how far back in our Bibles does this distinction go? Sproul goes on to explain this issue in the context of the ancient understanding of the original audience. J. Stuart Russell argues that the end of the age signals not merely an end, but a consummation of one age that is followed immediately by another. This was part of the traditional view of the Jews with regard to their Messiah. The new age that would be inaugurated by the appearance of Messiah would be called the Kingdom of Heaven. This idea was central to the preaching of John the Baptist, who spoke of the time that was at hand. Now, the key from Sproul to keep in mind is that these two ages in the New Testament original audience setting are sequential. That is, the consummation of this age would lead to its passing away, and the age to come would pick up the new covenant divine economy after the transition from the first to the second was complete. While the two ages overlapped in Jesus and the apostles' generation, technically the new age broke into this age during the last days of the old covenant age. That was a temporary 40-year transitional situation according to the Preterist view. These ages are sequential from one to the next and are not properly understood as parallel in any permanent sense. They are only parallel during the last days, the second Exodus generation, which is the biblical context of covenant transition. Some forms of futurism suggest that the last days continue for the entire history of the church until the supposed future consummation at the end of the world. This is very popular in Amillennialism. They view the last days of the Adamic Age as now ongoing, with the new covenant of Christ breaking into this age of the New Testament era, but that the coming of Christ, judgment at the end of the millennium and resurrection, that will mark the end of this Adamic age. So what I'm describing here about a sequential view of the two ages is not a new perspective or theological innovation at all. Preterists agree with the traditional view of seeing the end of the age as concurrent with the coming of Christ. They simply understand the transition as fulfilled by AD 70 rather than in terms of a future expectation. Well, here is Don Preston's explanation.
But if we understand that there is indeed this overlap, and I've seen charts that has a circle here and another circle with part of the circle within the other circle. And that area of overlap is known as a transitional period. It's still this age, but the age to come has broken into it. And by the way, folks, let me make this observation. Preterists did not invent this idea. We didn't come up with this. Scholars for centuries, literally, have recognized that there was an overlapping, an interconnection between what the Jews called this age versus the age to come.
I think that graph that Don Preston references is particularly helpful to visualize the transition from this age to the age to come. I found one version of that graph in a 2013 book by Charles Meek titled Christian Hope Through Fulfilled Prophecy: Is Your Church Teaching Error About the Last Days and Second Coming? I wrote a brief promotional that is on the back cover on the opening page. I don't know if you can see that there or not, but I did that because it is a very good presentation of preterism from 2013. I still recommend this book highly. It's excellent, and I will put a link in the description. Charles Meek has an appendix in that book titled A Tale of Two Ages that features two examples of the circle graph. Here's the first example that diagrams how this age and age to come is a sequential view. The overlap section between the old heavens and earth and the new heaven and earth gets all of the attention because the focus is on eschatology. But here's what the description says. The Bible divides time into two worlds or ages, this age and the age to come. They correspond to Old and New Covenant ages. The New Testament was written during the last days of the Old Covenant age, or what they call this age. The last days of that Old Covenant age were the 40-year transition period that ended in the destruction of the temple and Old Covenant world of law and sacrifice. Now, I look at this graph now and it astonishes me. If we understand a covenant end taking place during the transition period, which gets all the attention of preterists focused on eschatology, then what would that require the Protology to be about on the opening side of that circle? We all agree that the physical universe did not pass away in AD 70, right? A covenant end of the age requires a covenant beginning of the age. Do you see that? It necessarily must be a covenant beginning if we are talking about a covenant end of the age. If the opening side of the circle is the material creation, then the graph simply fails from a preterist view because the material creation did not end in the first century. This is one related circle denoting a covenant world from beginning to end. Notice also what defines this covenant world at the bottom: law and sacrifice. Well, where does law begin in the Bible? Well, the law of Moses was added to the covenant 430 years after Abraham, according to Galatians 3:17. But Paul associated the law of sin and death to the commandment which brought death as originating in the Garden of Eden in Romans 7 and 8. The law of Moses didn't bring death, it administered the death that came to Adam for breaking the commandment or law in the garden. Where does sacrifice originate in the Bible? Well, many claim the sacrifice happened in the garden when God clothed Adam and Eve with animal skins after their sin, implying a blood sacrifice for the animals to be slain. If animal sacrifice is introduced in the garden after Adam and Eve sin, then the old covenant is identified in the garden at the time of exile. It's debatable, but certainly we have an animal sacrifice explicitly by Genesis 4 when Abel offered his acceptable sacrifice taken from the firstborn of his flocks and herds. So these are types and shadows which identify the old covenant creation in the Adamic scene. And we'll focus more on this in the next video. But understood in that context, according to its own definitions, this graph, perhaps unintentionally, shows the covenant creation model. The old heaven and earth is the subject of Genesis 1 through 3. Furthermore, the graph demonstrates how in the beginning heaven and earth passed away by AD 70, proving that Genesis 1 through 3 cannot be describing the material creation and the origin of the physical universe. It's a temple text with Adam, the first priest, created to work and serve in the garden, the first sanctuary and holy place. Well, if the end of the age is fulfilled in a covenant context and doesn't have anything to do with the end of the physical world or world history, then wouldn't the beginning of the age apply in the same covenant context, which doesn't have anything to do with the physical world or world history? Well, the two preterist books I referenced above with Doug Wilson and R.C. Sproul from the 1990s had no discussion at all about issues related to Protology and the end of the age. It was simply not a part of the discussion back at that time. As far as I can tell, no one even thought to ponder this question back then. What is the beginning of the age that is coming to an end in Matthew 24 and the New Testament? But Preterism is a work in progress. By 2013, and this book by Charles Meek, Protology issues were unwittingly being represented without understanding their implications for Genesis creation. That Protology is a bare line on the far side to complete the circle labeled Old Heavens and Earth is the Old Covenant age, without any explanation. Do you know who was talking about the Protology of the end of the age by 2013? Well, my book with co-author Jeff Vaughn was published in 2007, Beyond Creation Science. So that discussion was taking place for about 5 years, but that discussion involved a limited group of pioneers, and many avoided the whole topic and questions that we were raising as if they were not relevant to issues of eschatology. But isn't that graph interesting? Maybe it helps you understand why the more this discussion takes place, the more people see what covenant creation is all about. It was always there, lying nondescript, unexplained, implicit in the very charts that preterists were designing to put in their books to promote preterism. Even authors who reject covenant creation. So this little demonstration begs a question. Is covenant creation making up something new? Or does covenant creation merely represent an awakening realization, the simple recognition of something that was always there? Preterists just didn't think about it until further study and reflection about the full implications and meaning of the end of the age and Matthew 24 fulfilled. Milton Terry is the big exception here because he certainly has a rudimentary covenant creation view of Genesis creation in his 1898 Biblical Apocalyptics book. He says Genesis 1 is as truly a sevenfold revelation of a beginning as the Apocalypse of St. John is a mystic revelation of an end. Do you see the parallel that is implied by that statement? He understood that they have to match, and he had some confusion because he was not a full preterist, but that certainly is a pregnant statement. The introduction of covenant creation in seed form by Milton Terry is documented in Beyond Creation Science. Well, are we talking about the end of the Adamic Age with the fulfillment of Matthew 24 and the destruction of the temple? Let me now show you the second graph in the Appendix B titled A Tale of Two Ages. This one is related to resurrection, and it labels the two circles earthly man and heavenly man, following Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. These are two covenant bodies, the first defined by Adam and the second defined by Christ. And this graph overlays the first graph perfectly from this age to age to come, paralleling Old Covenant and New Covenant. Here's what it says in the box. The New Testament was written during the last days of the Old Covenant world. Those last days were the 40-year transition period. This is why all the eschatological passages in the New Testament were addressed to their first century audience and imminent. Well, Meek is focused on eschatology and therefore seems to miss something that appears to me to be highly significant. What is the protology that Meek has established for his preterist view? What is the protology of the end of the Old Covenant? Well, it's explicitly Adam. He has placed the body of Adam inside the circle labeled as the Old Covenant world. That, my dear viewers, is a graph of covenant creation, although I suspect Charles Meek didn't consider those implications while putting this together. You see that line on the opening side of the circle? What would be the line representing the covenant creation view of Genesis 1, which introduces Adam as the beginning of the Old Covenant creation? Did the Genesis 1 world pass away according to this graph? Well, yes, indeed it did. This is a plain depiction of the covenant creation model, whether anyone recognized that or not back in 2013. So what I ask you to consider from this demonstration is something very important, because there are a lot of accusations flying around about the work of covenant creation. And a lot of people feel threatened, no doubt. There are sacred cows involved. But is covenant creation making this all up brand new? No, absolutely not. Is covenant creation simply recognizing what was always there? Yes, precisely. So we preterists just didn't think about it very much back then. And now we have arrived at an interesting and profound conclusion. Now we are thinking about it. The story of Adam in the garden is the protology of the old covenant creation, which passed away by AD 70. That means Genesis 1 through 3 has nothing to do with the beginning of the material creation. It is a temple dedication text to inaugurate the function of God's first priest, who works in the first holy place and sanctuary in the covenant presence of God. Let's add some passages to see if it makes biblical sense. This protology of the end of the age can be seen directly in Hebrews 1, 10 through 12, along with the parallel text of Revelation 21, 1. You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will all grow old like a garment. Like a cloak, you will fold them up, and they will be changed. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also, there was no more sea. Now let me ask you, can you see how that works in light of the preterist view? Covenant creation and covenant new creation. This is what preterism means. Now, if we go back to the first graph again, related to the two ages, we will see the explicit connection to creation text in the book of Hebrews. I use the Young's literal translation so you won't miss it. Some modern translations add universe or worlds because of the traditional bias regarding the subject of Genesis creation. But notice ages in the plural following the Greek are used in both Hebrews 1 and 11:3. In these last days did speak to us in a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he did make the ages. That is, two ages, both created via Jesus Christ, the God-man. By faith we understand the ages to have been prepared by a saying of God in regard to the things seen, not having come out of things appearing. Well, how did God create the old covenant creation? God spoke. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created, bara, that's the early Hebrew verb related to the older Hebrew noun, berith, for covenant, the heavens and the earth. Covenant is the means of God's creation. Covenants are spoken. It defines the nature of God's creation, and that also explains why covenant defines the nature of the curse in Genesis 3 as well. Now, I believe I can demonstrate that this covenant creation understanding is confirmed by recognized Hebrew scholars. Genesis 1:1 describes the beginning of the age. This is from John Sailhammer on the Hebrew meaning of in the beginning. Equally important in Genesis 1:1 is the meaning of the phrase in the beginning within the framework of the creation account and the book of Genesis. The term beginning in biblical Hebrew marks a starting point of a specific duration, as in the beginning of the year. The end of a specific period is marked by its antonym, the end, as in the end of the year. In opening the account of creation with the phrase in the beginning, the author has marked creation as the starting point of a period of time. Wow, this could get interesting. By commencing this history with a beginning, a word often paired with its antonym, end, the author has not only commenced a history of God and his people, but also prepared the way for the consummation of that history at the end of time. Of course, remember that Sailhammer is a dispensationalist here. He says the growing focus within the biblical canon on the times of the end is an appropriate extension of the end already anticipated in the beginning of Genesis 1:1. The fundamental principle reflected in 1:1 and the prophetic vision of the end times in the rest of Scripture is that the last things will be like the first things. Behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth. Then I saw a new heavens and a new earth, Revelation 21:1. The allusions to Genesis 1 and 2 in Revelation 22 illustrate the role that these early chapters of Genesis played in shaping the form and content of the scriptural vision of the future. Already in Genesis 1:1, the concept of the last days fills the mind of the reader. And that's quoting Otto Proksch from 1913. But what I find fascinating is that Sailhammer is a dispensationalist, but when speaking about the meaning of the Hebrew terms in Genesis 1:1, he describes the protology of the age concept that comes to fulfillment with the preterist eschatology of the end of the age. Does the Adamic Age come to fulfillment by AD 70? Well, here's a citation from G.K. Beale, an amillennialist, that seems relevant to the question at hand. Beale writes, the reason that Jesus reflects both the Old Testament figures of Adam and Israel is because, as we have seen earlier, Israel and her patriarchs are given the same commission as was Adam in Genesis 1:26-28. Consequently, it is not an overstatement to understand Israel as a corporate Adam who had failed in their Garden of Eden in much the same way as their primal father had failed in the first garden. For these reasons, it is understandable that Jesus is called Son of God, partly because that was a name for the first Adam and for Israel. Well, you think about that for a second. If Adam is called God's firstborn son in Genesis 5 and Luke 3, and Israel is called God's firstborn son in Exodus 4 and Hosea 11, then the story of Adam is covenantally united to the story of Israel. How can God have two different firstborn sons under the old covenant? That is neither logical nor biblically possible. Thus, Israel, the priestly nation, is the extension of the old covenant story, which began with Adam, God's first priest. This Adamic association to the patriarchs of Israel occurs all through the book of Genesis, but I like this representative example that opens Exodus. That's where we read, and Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land, Eretz, was filled with them. So the language here in Hebrew is the same as Genesis 1:28. Jacob is identified as the father of the Adamic people, the priestly family of God. Beale brings the eschatology of the Adamic Age into view as he continues. Likewise, the expression Son of Man from Daniel 7:13 refers to end times Israel and her representative king as the son of Adam who is sovereign over beasts. Recall that the Son of Man takes over the kingdoms of former evil empires portrayed as beasts. Understandably, against this background, it is natural that Son of Man became one of Jesus's favorite ways of referring to himself. Thus, Christ is the Son of Adam, or the Son of Man, who has begun to do what the first should have done and to inherit what the first Adam should have inherited. So, given this covenant identification between Adam and Israel under the Old Covenant, how would it be biblically possible to understand Old Covenant Israel was judged and passed away in AD 70, but the Adamic Age continues? That's incoherent. Adam and Israel are united under the Old Covenant creation from Genesis 1 forward. For Israel to have an end, in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32, means the Adamic Age ends concurrently and with the same covenant context. The eschatology of Israel is the extension of the eschatology of Adam. Adam is God's firstborn son, just as Israel is later called God's firstborn son in Exodus 4 and Hosea 11. They are linked by their priestly function and purpose. Don Preston draws the same powerful link between the story of Adam and the story of Israel when it comes to the doctrine of resurrection. First and foremost is the undeniable fact that Paul, when considering the resurrection from the death of Adam, posited that resurrection as the fulfillment of God's promises to Old Covenant Israel. He directly cites Isaiah 25 and Hosea 13, not to mention the fact that he indirectly alludes to Daniel 9, Daniel 12, the Psalms, and other Old Testament prophecies. This means that the promise of resurrection made in the garden is incorporated into Yahweh's promises to Old Covenant Israel. So the story of the garden becomes the story of Israel. Now I want to run through a list of citations from recognized preterist writers, and you can be the judge on your own if they match Preston's teaching that the Adamic Age reaches its consummation and conclusion by AD 70. This is from Joel McDermott from 2011. Paul very clearly saw the same two ages Jesus did. One age that was currently operating when he wrote, and another age that would dominate the future. The question is, when does the switch between these ages occur? Paul very clearly indicates that a switch was occurring as he wrote, and indeed the old age, what we might call the Old Testament age, was coming to an end as he wrote. Old Testament age? That would be the one that opens at Genesis 1:1, correct? Old Testament equals Old Covenant. Is it really hard to understand covenant creation? Well, that's it right there. How about Max King on the opening page of his 1987 book? Our primary aim in this volume, as indicated by the title, is to show that Christ's cross and parousia, i.e. his presence or arrival, commonly called the second coming, are the two foci of one complete indivisible eschaton, end time, that pertain to the fulfillment of all redemptive history and prophecy within the closing period, last days, of the Old Testament age. Doug Wilson indicates the scope of the old heavens and earth, which identifies the origin indirectly. He says, so then the heavens and earth are a figure for the kingdoms of heaven and earth. The new heavens and the new earth are a figure for the glorious and ever-increasing reign of our Lord Jesus Christ. So note here, that's not just one kingdom or limited to Israel alone. It's kingdoms, plural, necessitating the Adamic heavens and earth to pass away in Wilson's view in the transition to the kingdom of Christ. And by the way, this is the theological background for the prophetic ministry of Israel's prophets sent to the nations, like Jonah going to Assyria and Jeremiah being called the prophet to the nations, along with the priestly ministry of Daniel to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. All these kingdoms are under the reign of God from the very beginning because they are part of the heavens, earth, sea, old covenant creation that is symbolized by Israel's temple. One of my favorites is this quote by James B. Jordan. He says, "Let us be clear about this. The destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem was not merely the end of the Hebrew, Israelite, Jewish period of history that began with Abraham. It was the end of the entire old creation from Adam forward. The church is the replacement not merely of Israel, but also of the older and larger Gentile world that began with Adam and continued through the Noahic covenant. The kingdom of Jesus is a holy new creation and nothing less." Did you get that? The Adamic creation has been displaced by the new covenant creation. The Adamic age has passed away, and we minimize the scope of the new creation in Jesus Christ if we begin with, say, Abraham. Jesus is not just a new Abraham. He is the new Adam. Jordan's Daniel commentary incorporates that understanding in the eschatology of Daniel. Here we have the introduction to Herod. Herod the Great is the climax in one way of the entire history of Adam. Adam sought to make himself God, and with Herod we come to one climax of the history of Adam. The wicked Jews form a different climax of that history, focusing on worship and the sanctuary. But here the focus is on land and political power. Peter Leithart echoes the full context of biblical eschatology by saying this in his 2004 book. Within the preterist framework, we concluded that the angels who sinned were judged in the first century judgment on the old covenant. Perhaps this is why 1 Peter 4:5 says that Jesus is ready to judge the living and the dead. The fall of Jerusalem was a judgment not only of apostate Judaism, but on the pre-flood generation as well. All the blood from Abel on were charged to that generation. Well, the link between Adam, God's firstborn son, who later became Israel, God's firstborn son, explains the covenant connection that Jesus taught in Matthew 23, 35 through 36. Jesus says the judgment to come in this generation reaches all the way back to the opening chapters of Genesis. This is not hard to understand. Jesus offered the context for the Great Tribulation in Matthew 24, 21. Do you remember what he said? He said, from the beginning of creation, this is going to be the Great Tribulation. Did you ever notice that Jesus takes the scope back to Genesis creation for events to be fulfilled in this generation? That's why David Chilton explains the Adamic context this way. The disciples understood the significance of this. They knew that Christ's coming in judgment to destroy the temple would mean the utter dissolution of Israel as the covenant nation. It would be the sign that God had divorced Israel, removing himself from their midst, taking the kingdom from her, and giving it to another nation. Matthew 21:43. It would signal the end of the age and the coming of an entirely new era in world history. Jesus Christ's new world order. From the beginning of creation until AD 70, the world was organized around one central sanctuary, one single house of God. Now in the new covenant order, sanctuaries are established wherever true worship exists. Leithart's 2000 book titled A House for My Name has this fascinating explanation in the very last endnote of the book. He says, Jesus tells the Jews they cannot follow where he is going. He contrasts himself with the Jews. He is from above, born of the Spirit, and born from above, but they are born from below, of the earth, earthy. The above-below contrast is parallel to the contrast of being of this world and not of this world. The Jews are of this world, but Jesus is not. Thus, the Jews are of this world, originating in this world and operating according to the norms of this world and its ruler. The world refers to the old covenant system, the Adamic order of things corrupted by sin, and specifically the Adamic order as it has been given specific shape in first century Judaism. And that's probably where we can think about 1 Corinthians 7:31, where Paul writes, "For the form of this world is passing away." That helps us to understand this observation from Kim Burgess and Gary DeMar's new book, The Hope of Israel. Moses is not the source of any age. No age is said to begin with Moses. The age of sin, condemnation, and death began with Adam. Once again, age in the New Testament is used not as a synonym for covenant or covenantal administration, but as an Adamic and therefore world order term. So if no age began with Moses, then the end of the age, fulfilled by AD 70, necessarily means the end of the Adamic age and the old covenant world. And again, Paul, for the form of this world is passing away. How did futurists try to avoid the fulfillment of Matthew 24 in the first century with the destruction of Jerusalem? They try to dichotomize the old covenant from the end of the age. Gary DeMar explains this strategy. In my debate with Dr. Michael Brown on the fulfillment of Matthew 24, he spent considerable time dismissing the argument that the end of the age, verse 3, referred to the end of the old covenant system of sacrifice, cleansings, food regulations, and priestly oversight. He implied that the end of the age was yet in the future. So if you follow that citation, Gary DeMar teaches that the end of the age was fulfilled by AD 70. And when Gary DeMar debates futurists, he argues that the end of the age is the end of the old covenant age. That's been Gary DeMar's argument for more than 30 years now. If age does not mean old covenant age, then all the futurists that Gary DeMar has debated were right when they claim Matthew 24 remains unfulfilled in any final sense. I spoke about this in my review of Burgess and DeMar's new book, The Hope of Israel, Volume 2. There's a link in the description if you're interested. Here is how Gary DeMar explains the issue. What age or period of time was about to come to an end when Jesus' disciples asked about the end of the age in Matthew 24:3, after they heard Jesus say that the temple was going to be left desolate? The end of the Old Covenant age was on the horizon with the ministry of Jesus. The age to come is not heaven or the eternal state, but the New Covenant age. The New Testament church was in a transition phase, 80, 30 to 70, between the passing away of the Old Covenant age and the New Covenant age. Does Gary DeMar believe that the end of the Adamic age was fulfilled in AD 70? Well, just a few months before the Gary DeMar controversy of 2023 erupted, he explained it this way. I believe the end of the age was the end of the Old Covenant age. And as my friend Kim Burgess says, it's not just the end of the Old Covenant age, but the end of the Adamic age as well. Jesus is the second Adam. If you go through all the steps in Jesus' ministry, you'll see that some of them are Adamic and some of them come out of the other covenants as well. I believe the end of the age took place in that transition period between AD 30 to AD 70. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:11 talks about upon whom the ends of the ages have come. The theology boils down to this description offered all the way back in 1988 by James B. Jordan. Theologians sometimes use Old Covenant to refer to the Mosaic Covenant. There is truth to this in that the Mosaic Covenant published most fully the distinctive character of the Adamic Covenant under curse. Yet ultimately, the Old Covenant is the covenant of the original Garden of Eden. Ultimately, there are two covenants, old and new. There are two Adams, Adam and Jesus. There are two heavens and earth, the first in Adam and the second in Christ. To that excellent statement, we could add the preterist idea that there are two ages, the Old Covenant age and the New Covenant age. So I hope you see by now that the end of the Adamic age is what preterism has always taught, whether or not the writers understood the profound theological ramifications. What I find fascinating is that some preterist authors already understand that preterism, if true, means something very, very big. Consider Peter Leithart from his Revelation commentary in the introduction. He says, a small number of preterists, calling themselves consistent or full preterists, but labeled hyper-preterists by their opponents, take the view that everything in Revelation was fulfilled before or in AD 70. Even the millennium and final judgment are squeezed into this time frame. That position not only rejects the near universal confession of the church, he will come again to judge the quick and the dead, but it also causes havoc to other teachings of Scripture. Some argue, for instance, that the resurrection described in 1 Corinthians 15 has already happened. If that is the case, resurrection of the body no longer means what it has meant in historic Christianity, with massive implications not only for eschatology, but anthropology and the doctrine of creation. This is the very same Peter Leithart who says the Adamic world was judged in the first century. This is the very same Peter Leithart who agrees the Adamic order came to a conclusion in first century Judaism. This is the very same Peter Leithart who agrees the end of the age was fulfilled by AD 70. I suspect he has not thought this through. The Adamic world judgment occurs at the end of the millennium according to traditional Christian theology. So make a note of this because Peter Leithart can't have it both ways. The end of the Adamic age proves full preterism is true. Now, what are the implications of preterism for anthropology and the doctrine of creation? Well, the upcoming videos are designed to investigate that question very deeply. While I am sure many questions remain for you, is it really hard to see the issue now? Traditional salvation theologies teach that we perpetually live in the transition period, an ongoing parallel Old Covenant existence in Adam, right side by side with a new covenant creation in Christ, and both are simultaneous, not sequential. Traditional federal theology views federal headship of both Adam and Jesus as parallel and continuing until the end of the Adamic world at the second coming. But Preterism claims this old covenant Adamic world ended in the first century. So Preterists teach the second coming is in our past, not in our future. So how in the world does the Adamic order continue beyond the consummation of the Adamic age? What's going on here? They believe the transition period has been going on for 2,000 years and counting. Traditional federal theology is inescapably futurist salvation theology, or you could think of it as the ongoing Exodus generation that goes for thousands and thousands of years. So if you don't see the problem yet, just start reading Soteriology doctrine for yourself. At the end of this paper, I hope to demonstrate that this double justification doctrine, initial justification by faith alone, followed by a second justification according to works in the eschatological judgment, is reemerging as a consensus position among today's leading evangelical and Reformed theologians. That's from Rich Lusk, and I'll point out that the judgment according to works is an old covenant judgment at the end of the millennium. That's the sticking point here in the debates over the doctrine of justification. Here's another example. There is a very broad consensus among many New Testament scholars on the conclusion that Christians are justified in one sense, but still need to be delivered from the judicial wrath of God to come. Romans 5, 1 through 11. It seems natural to apply to the two phases of justification the same terminology that scholars have adopted for New Testament eschatology in general. We are already justified, but we are not yet justified. Now in the present, we have tasted of our future justification. The justification of God's people has been inaugurated. It has yet to be consummated. Translation: Soteriology cannot be divorced from eschatology. Preterism shows conclusively that the Adamic age ended by AD 70. How can anyone still be under the Adamic Old Covenant status and jurisdiction if the Adamic age passed away? I referenced this little discussed problem for preterism in the forward and outline at the very opening episode of this Covenant Creation Curriculum series. We will talk more about it in part 4. Now, some have suggested that this means universalism. And the argument is that since the traditional view of Adam and curse in Genesis is universal for the origin of all human beings and the entire physical world, which is cursed, then the logical conclusion from that starting point is that the end of the Adamic age means universal salvation for all human beings after AD 70. Max King arrived at that conclusion. But Max King assumed the traditional view of Genesis 1 and universal Adam doctrine. Link to a video I made about Max King and Genesis 1 in the description of this video. But here's a question to ponder in closing. What do Ed Stevens and Max King agree about? Did you know that Ed Stevens teaches the same thing that Max King teaches about Genesis 1? They believe that Adam was the first human being on planet Earth together. Ironic? Who is promoting the root of universalist doctrine from preterist conclusions? Well, that would be anyone promoting the Augustinian doctrine of a universal Adam matched with full preterism. Ed Stevens and Max King 100% agree on that starting point because they both refuse to consider covenant context for Genesis 1 through 3. But was the context of creation in Adam related to the physical origins and material creation? No, the physical universe did not pass away by AD 70. And if the beginning of the age does not refer to the beginning of the physical world, then Adam isn't the beginning of all humanity. Let's be consistent. The context of Genesis creation is a temple dedication text. The garden, sanctuary, and Adam, the first priest, who was given the purpose and function to represent God to others. This is about the gospel from the very beginning. Adam is the first covenant man, and Jesus is the last covenant man. The only way you get universalism with preterism is if you teach a universal Adam in Genesis. But if Adam was God's first priest in the first holy place, the first temple, the first sanctuary of God's covenant creation, the first Son of God, then this is a family story. Does this presentation intrigue you about the solutions covenant creation potentially offers Christian theology? Are you willing to investigate further? Rest, Neo. The answers are coming.